The stone dust hangs in the mountain air like fog. It's 1891, and on a plateau above the French Broad River, men are cutting limestone. The sound of chisels on rock echoes through the Blue Ridge. Hundreds of workers, stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from the Carolina Mountains, day laborers earning pennies are raising something that shouldn't exist here. A French château in North Carolina. 4 acres under one roof, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall with a ceiling that will soar 70 feet. The man who ordered this is 29 years old. He inherited a railroad fortune built on other men's sweat and steel. His name is Vanderbilt. His grandfather controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury. This house will take 5 years to build. It will cost millions, over 100 million in today's money. And that's just construction. The real cost, the cost of keeping it alive, that's the story nobody tells. Because the Vanderbilts weren't the only family to build palaces like this. Across America and Europe, the richest families of the Gilded Age, the Astors, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds raised monuments to their fortunes, grand estates, sprawling parks, libraries full of rare books, and then one by one the bills came due. This is the story of what happened to the Rothschild family estates, the palaces that were supposed to last forever, the dream that slowly ate itself alive. This is the story of the Rothschild estates. Not one house, but a network of them. Waddesdon Manor in England, Ferrières outside Paris, palaces in Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples, each one a masterpiece. Each one built to prove that a Jewish banking family could claim a place among Europe's oldest aristocracy. Each one paid for with a fortune that spanned continents and shaped the fate of nations. The Rothschild name became shorthand for wealth itself. 5 brothers, 5 cities, one banking network that financed wars, built railroads, and moved gold faster than governments could track it. By the mid-1800s, they were indispensable. Kings borrowed from them. Prime ministers consulted them. And when they wanted to show the world what they had built, they built houses that looked like royal palaces. But palaces come with hidden costs. Staff to feed, roofs to repair, taxes that climb every year. And for the Rothschilds, something else, an invisible weight that pressed down on every gilded surface. They were outsiders, Jewish in a Christian world, immigrants in countries that resented their success. No matter how perfect the architecture, no matter how exquisite the gardens, they were always one political shift away from losing everything. The estates were fortresses. They were also fragile. What the tour guides don't mention when you visit Waddesdon today, the pristine gardens, the glittering chandeliers, the guided tours through rooms that smell faintly of furniture polish, is what it took to keep these places alive. The servants who worked 16-hour days, the families forced to sell when taxes became unbearable, the estates seized by Nazis, the slow surrender as one generation after another realized they couldn't hold on. This is the dark, complex story of the Rothschild estates. Not just what was built, but what was lost. Who paid for the dream? And what remains when the dream can no longer afford itself? The story begins in Frankfurt, 1744. Mayor Amschel Rothschild is born in the Jewish ghetto, a walled quarter where Jews are locked in at night and forbidden from owning land. His father is a money changer. The family lives above a small shop marked with a red shield, Rothschild in German. By the time Mayer dies in 1812, his 5 sons control the most powerful banking network Europe has ever seen. Nathan in London, James in Paris, Solomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt. They don't just move money, they move information. Encrypted letters, couriers on horseback. They know about wars before governments do. And they use that knowledge to position themselves at the center of European power. But power without land means nothing in the 19th century. Land is status, land is permanence, and Jews are still banned from owning it in most places. The brothers begin to buy estates the moment laws allow, not modest country homes, palaces. Mayer's strategy was simple and revolutionary. He sent each son to a different financial capital. They would work independently but think collectively. A loan issued in London could be backed by gold in Vienna. Intelligence gathered in Paris could inform decisions in Naples. The family communicated constantly, using Yiddish and Hebrew phrases mixed with commercial codes that outsiders couldn't decipher. When Napoleon marched across Europe, the Rothschilds financed both sides not out of disloyalty, but because neutrality meant survival. Nations rose and fell. The banking network endured. By 1815, after Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild in London had become the most powerful financier in Europe. He knew Napoleon had been defeated before the British government did. His couriers crossed the Channel faster than official dispatches. He used that information to position himself in the bond market and made a fortune. Later accounts turned this into legend. Some claimed he manipulated prices through deception. The truth was simpler and more remarkable. He had better information and moved faster than anyone else. The brothers understood that money alone wouldn't secure their position. European aristocracy measured worth in land, titles, and lineage stretching back centuries. The Rothschilds had none of that. What they had was capital. And in the 19th century, capital could buy almost anything. As laws restricting Jewish land ownership began to ease, the brothers started purchasing estates. Not farmland, not modest manors. They bought properties that announced their arrival, that forced the old aristocracy to acknowledge them as equals. Each estate was a statement. We have not just arrived, we belong. But belonging purchased through architecture is always conditional. The estates were built to project permanence. History would test whether stone and gold were enough. Stand at the gates of Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, England, and the first thing you notice is how out of place it looks. A French Renaissance château dropped onto an English hilltop like a piece of theatre. It was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild between 1874 and 1889, 15 years of construction, millions of pounds, and a vision so specific that every stone was numbered before it left the quarry. Ferdinand was sickly as a child, fragile, not expected to survive. His brothers ran the family bank. He collected art. When his young wife died in childbirth, he withdrew from the financial empire and poured everything into building something beautiful. Something that would prove the Rothschilds belonged in England as much as any duke or earl. The house was designed to overwhelm. Gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers, paintings that had once belonged to French royalty, a wine cellar that rivaled the Queen's, and beneath it all, a hidden city basement kitchens, servant corridors, coal rooms and quarters for the staff who made the dream run. Over 100 people worked at Waddesdon. Their names appear in payroll ledgers but almost nowhere else. Ferdinand hired a French architect, Hippolyte Destelure, precisely because he wanted something that looked nothing like an English country house. No Georgian symmetry, no restrained classical proportions. He wanted Loire Valley grandeur towers, steep roofs, ornamental stonework. The message was deliberate. I understand European culture as well as anyone born into it. Better, perhaps. The site itself was a challenge, a bare, wind-swept hill with no natural advantages. Everything had to be hauled upward, stone from Bath, slate from Wales, carved elements from France. A private railway spur was built to bring materials close. Steam engines powered the excavation. The approach road wound up the hill in carefully calculated curves, revealing the château in stages, building anticipation with every turn. Inside, every room told a story. The smoking room was panelled in Italian walnut. The breakfast room had Sevres porcelain set into the walls. The library held 10,000 volumes, many of them rare first editions. Ferdinand personally selected every painting, every piece of furniture, every decorative object. This wasn't just a house. It was a curated collection designed to prove that a Jewish banker understood beauty, history, and craftsmanship as deeply as any aristocrat whose family tree stretched back to the Normans. But the real innovation was invisible. Central heating, still rare in the 1880s. Electric lighting throughout. Hot and cold running water in every bathroom. Waddesdon was technologically advanced in ways that made older English estates look medieval. Ferdinand believed modernity and tradition could coexist. The architecture referenced the 16th century. The infrastructure belonged to the future, and the cost staggering. But Ferdinand believed he could afford it. The family fortune seemed inexhaustible. If Waddesdon was Ferdinand's private retreat, Ferrières was the Rothschild family's declaration of arrival. Built by James de Rothschild between 1855 and 1859 outside Paris, Ferrières was the largest private château in France. Bigger than most royal palaces, the central hall soared over 100 feet. The estate covered nearly 3,000 acres. And when it opened, Emperor Napoleon III himself came to visit. He reportedly walked through the rooms and said, "Kings couldn't afford this. I certainly couldn't." It was meant as a compliment. It was also a warning. James had designed Ferrières to signal that the Rothschilds were no longer merely bankers. They were peers, equals. The problem was that not everyone agreed. The French press mocked the house as Jewish ostentation. Cartoons appeared showing Rothschild figures clutching money bags in front of the château. And beneath the glittering surface, the same question hung in every room. What happens when the people you're trying to impress don't want you there? James hired Joseph Paxton, the English architect who had designed the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851. Paxton understood scale. He understood how to create spaces that overwhelmed the senses. The central hall at Ferrières was designed as a covered courtyard, soaring skyward with a glass roof flooding the space with light. Marble columns, intricate ironwork, a double staircase sweeping upward. Guests arrived and had to pause, forced to absorb the sheer ambition of what they were seeing. The estate included everything a royal palace would have: stables for dozens of horses, kennels for hunting dogs, a private theatre, formal gardens designed by the same landscape architects who worked on Versailles. James stocked the estate with game birds and deer for hunting parties that attracted the highest levels of French society. Ministers, diplomats, financiers all came to Ferrières, and all understood that being invited meant something. It meant James considered you important. But the house also exposed the family's vulnerability. The French aristocracy came. They admired the art. They praised the wine. Then they went home and made jokes. The satirical press was ruthless. Caricatures depicted Rothschilds as grotesque figures with exaggerated features, hooked noses, and grasping hands. The anti-Semitism was open, casual, normalized. James's response was to double down. More art, more grandeur, more perfection. If they were going to mock him anyway, he would make the spectacle so impressive that ignoring him became impossible. The emperor's visit was the pinnacle. Napoleon III arrived with his court. James hosted a hunt, a banquet, a tour of the collections. And the emperor's remark, "Kings couldn't afford this," became famous. It was recognition, but it was also a reminder. This level of wealth made people uncomfortable. It raised questions about where money came from and who really controlled power in France. Questions that would grow more dangerous with time. Walk through Waddesdon or Ferrières today, and you see what visitors are meant to see: grand staircases, hand-painted ceilings, museum-quality furniture. What you don't see is the infrastructure. At Waddesdon, the basement stretched like a maze, kitchens the size of small factories, sculleries where maids scrubbed pots in scalding water, laundries that processed hundreds of sheets a week, coal rooms where men shoveled fuel into boilers that heated the entire house, and narrow servant staircases hidden behind walls so staff could move between floors without ever being seen by the family or guests. The division was absolute. Upstairs, silk and champagne. Downstairs, 16-hour shifts and wages that barely covered rent. The Rothschilds were considered good employers by the standards of the time. They paid better than most aristocratic families. They provided housing and medical care. But better than most still meant a system built on profound inequality. The beauty upstairs depended entirely on the invisible labor below, and everyone knew it, even if nobody said it aloud. At Waddesdon, the household staff numbered over 100. Footmen wore livery and answered call buttons. Maids rose before dawn to light fires, clean grates, and polish surfaces. Cooks prepared elaborate multi-course meals for family and guests, then simpler fare for the staff. The hierarchy was rigid. The butler controlled the male staff. The housekeeper managed the women. Under them ranks descended: ladies' maids, valets, housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, hall boys. Everyone knew their place. Wages reflected the hierarchy. A head housemaid might earn £30 a year, a scullery maid 12. The butler drew closer to 80, plus accommodation and food. These were competitive rates for the era, better than factory work, steadier than farm labor. But context matters. Ferdinand routinely spent thousands of pounds on a single painting. The annual wage bill for the entire household was less than the cost of one major artwork. The working conditions were punishing. Kitchen staff labored in stifling heat. Laundresses wrestled with heavy wet linens. Groundskeepers worked in all weather, maintaining the acres of formal gardens. And the work never stopped. Fires had to be lit. Meals had to be served. Rooms had to be cleaned. The estate ran on a schedule as precise as factory production, except the product was the illusion of effortless luxury. Servants lived on the estate, in quarters separate from the main house. At Waddesdon, these were decent by contemporary standards, clean, heated, better than many working-class homes. But the boundary was absolute. Staff entered through separate doors. They used hidden staircases. They were expected to be invisible unless summoned. The architecture enforced the class divide as surely as any law. By 1900, the Rothschild estates were complete. Waddesdon, Ferrières, Mentmore in England, Schillersdorf in Austria, each one a masterpiece, each one consuming money at a staggering rate. Heating Waddesdon alone cost thousands of pounds a year. The roof required constant repair. Plumbing systems built in the 1880s needed updating. Gardens demanded full-time staff, and property taxes kept climbing. The estates were designed to signal permanence, but permanence is expensive. The Rothschilds could afford it. Their banking empire still generated enormous income, but the arithmetic was delicate. The houses didn't earn money. They absorbed it. And as the 20th century arrived, the pressures began to multiply. Income taxes, inheritance taxes, wars that disrupted trade and devalued currency. The balancing act that had seemed sustainable in the 1890s started to feel precarious. The Rothschilds kept meticulous records. Estate ledgers itemize everything: coal deliveries, staff wages, repairs to stonework, replacement of roof slates, purchases of lamp oil and candles before electricity became standard. At Waddesdon, the monthly operating costs ran into hundreds of pounds. Multiply that across multiple estates, and the family was spending tens of thousands of pounds annually just on maintenance. The estates generated no income. They were pure expenditure. The family's wealth came from banking, investments, and industrial holdings. The houses were funded by those profits. As long as the income stream remained strong, the system worked. But it was vulnerable to any disruption: market crashes, political instability, changes in tax policy. Britain introduced new property taxes and inheritance duties in the early 1900s. France followed. Suddenly, transferring estates from one generation to the next triggered massive tax bills. Families across Europe began selling off land and houses. The aristocracy that had ruled for centuries was being financially dismantled by democratic governments that needed revenue. The Rothschilds faced the same pressures. They had more capital than most families, so they could absorb shocks that would bankrupt others. But each shock reduced their buffer. Each tax increase made the estates harder to justify, and beneath the financial calculations lay a deeper question: why maintain these houses at all? They had been built to prove belonging, to force acceptance from the aristocracy. But the aristocracy itself was declining. The old social order was crumbling. The estates were magnificent, but their original purpose was fading. For now the houses stood. The gardens stayed immaculate. The staff kept working. But the foundation, the financial and social logic that had made building them seem rational, was eroding. The Rothschilds didn't know it yet, but the estates were already living on borrowed time. When war broke out in August 1914, the Rothschild banking network, designed to operate across borders, built on blood ties between cousins in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt suddenly became impossible to maintain. Nations demanded loyalty. You were British or German or French or Austrian. You couldn't be all of them at once. The London Rothschilds were British. The Vienna and Frankfurt branches belonged to the Central Powers. Cousins who had worked together for generations woke up on opposite sides of the war. Communications stopped. Business ties were severed. Properties were watched. In some places, Rothschild assets were labeled enemy property, not because of anything the family had done, but because of where they lived. The war shattered the illusion that wealth could float above politics, and when it ended, the damage was permanent. The Vienna branch, once among the most powerful, was crippled by the collapse of Austria-Hungary. The Frankfurt house faced similar ruin in a defeated Germany. The estates, which had symbolized stability, suddenly looked vulnerable. Lionel Walter Rothschild, Ferdinand's nephew, was a British citizen with German relatives. In public, he supported the British war effort without hesitation. In private, he received news about cousins in Vienna and Frankfurt whose businesses were being undermined, whose movements were restricted, whose assets were under surveillance. What do you do when your own family becomes the official enemy? The practical answer: stop talking. The London house severed formal communication with Vienna and Frankfurt. Business relationships that had functioned smoothly for nearly a century were suspended. Each branch now had to prove loyalty to its own government. The easiest way to do that was to act as if the other branches didn't exist. The war also hit the estates directly. Waddesdon staff shrank as men enlisted or were conscripted. Footmen, gardeners, stable hands they left for the front. Some came back wounded. Some came back in coffins. Some never came back at all. Their names are carved on the estate's war memorial, raised after the fighting ended. A simple stone. The list runs alphabetically. In death, the hierarchy finally fell silent. The house kept functioning, but barely. With reduced staff, rooms were closed. Gardens were simplified. Maintenance was deferred. Ferdinand had died in 1898, so it fell to his heirs to navigate the crisis. They managed, but the war taught a brutal lesson. No amount of wealth could insulate anyone from industrialized slaughter. In France, Ferrières was requisitioned for military use. Soldiers bivouacked in rooms designed for emperors. Equipment was stored in the Great Hall. The estate survived physically, but the damage to furnishings and grounds was extensive. When the family returned after the war, repairs cost a fortune. The wider Rothschild network was shattered. The Vienna branch lost much of its capital when Austria-Hungary collapsed. The Frankfurt house faced hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic. What had taken 5 generations to build fractured along national lines in 4 years. The Rothschilds had always faced prejudice, casual slights, whispered jokes, clubs that wouldn't admit them. But by the 1920s and 1930s, anti-Semitism was hardening into something organized and dangerous. Nazi propaganda fixated on the Rothschild name. Posters depicted grotesque caricatures clutching the world in clawed hands. Pamphlets claimed Jewish bankers had caused the war, manipulated governments, and secretly controlled nations. The family's visibility made them perfect symbols. Their estates Waddesdon, Ferrières, the Vienna palaces became Exhibit A in anti-Semitic narratives about Jewish wealth and power. In Germany and Austria, the pressure intensified. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Properties were seized under legal pretexts. Rothschild family members began moving to London and Paris, abandoning estates they'd spent decades building. By the mid-1930s, the question was no longer whether the estates would survive. It was whether the family would. The anti-Semitism wasn't new, but the scale and organization were. In the 19th century, prejudice had been social exclusion from clubs, mockery in drawing rooms, caricatures in satirical magazines. By the 1930s, it was political. Parties built entire platforms around it. Governments passed laws targeting Jewish wealth. Newspapers published lists of Jewish-owned businesses to boycott. The Rothschilds were named constantly. Their banking network, their estates, their art collections all became evidence in conspiracy theories about Jewish control. The fact that the family had financed governments, built railways, and influenced markets was reframed as proof of sinister manipulation. What had once been business was now a crime in the eyes of those who hated them. In Germany, the Nazis made the Rothschilds a central symbol. Propaganda films depicted them as puppet masters behind wars and economic crises. The messaging was clear: Jewish wealth was illegitimate, dangerous, and needed to be destroyed. The estates made this abstract hatred concrete. People could point to Waddesdon or Ferrières and say, "Look what they built with stolen money." It didn't matter that the accusation was false. It stuck. Letters from relatives in Germany and Austria reached London and Paris with increasingly dire reports. Businesses were being boycotted. Bank accounts were being frozen. Properties were being seized under laws that gave the state power to confiscate enemy assets. The family began moving people out, helping relatives emigrate, transferring assets to safer countries, preparing for the worst. By 1937, it was clear that the estates in Germany and Austria couldn't be held. The choice was stark: sell them at a loss or lose them entirely when the Nazis took power. Some were sold in hurried transactions. Others were simply abandoned as family members fled. The dream of permanence that had driven the estate building a generation earlier was collapsing into a desperate scramble for survival. November 9, 1938. Kristallnacht. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues burn. Jewish shops are smashed. Men are dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. The violence is state-directed, coordinated, and deliberate. In Frankfurt, the Rothschild ancestral house, the place where Mayor Amschel had started the banking empire, is seized. The family bank is forced to close. Properties are confiscated. The same thing happens in Vienna. Palaces that took decades to build are emptied in weeks. Art is stolen. Furniture is auctioned. Bank accounts are frozen. Some Rothschild family members escape to London or New York. Others are caught. Exact numbers are incomplete. Holocaust records were deliberately destroyed, but Rothschild relatives died in camps. The estates in Germany and Austria are gone, erased. Not gradually through financial strain, but through violence backed by the state. The Frankfurt house was more than just property. It was the birthplace of the Rothschild empire. The small shop with the red shield where Mayor Amschel had started his money-changing business. The family had maintained it for generations, even after moving their primary operations to grander buildings. It was a symbol, a connection to their origins. And on November 9, it was seized by Nazi authorities. The doors were locked, the contents were inventoried. The building was transferred to state control. The Vienna palaces suffered the same fate. The Rothschilds had built multiple estates in and around Vienna. Elegant townhouses, country estates, each one filled with art, furniture, and books collected over decades. Nazi officials arrived with lists. They knew what they wanted. Hermann Göring himself visited some of the properties, personally selecting paintings and sculptures for his private collection. The thefts were documented, receipts were written. This wasn't random looting, it was systematic plunder backed by law. Some family members managed to escape. They packed what they could carry and fled to France, England, or America. Others were slower to act, unwilling to believe that things could get as bad as the warnings suggested. They waited too long. By 1939, borders were closing. Exit visas became nearly impossible to obtain. Some Rothschilds were trapped. Some perished in concentration camps. The exact number will never be known with certainty. Holocaust records were incomplete and often destroyed. But the family lost members. The estates were gone, and the dream of permanence, the belief that stone and gold could provide safety, was revealed as an illusion. In London and Paris, the remaining branches of the family read the reports with horror and guilt. They had survived, others hadn't. The estates in Germany and Austria were lost forever. Some would be returned after the war, but damaged, stripped, shadows of what they had been. Most would never come back at all. In June 1940, Germany invades France. Paris falls. Ferrières, the grand château that James de Rothschild built to host emperors, is seized by the Nazis. Hermann Göring personally selects pieces from the Rothschild art collection for his private hoard. German officers take over the rooms. The theft is systematic. documented, legal under Nazi occupation law. Meanwhile, in England, Waddesdon survives, but barely. The house is dark. Windows are taped against bomb blasts. Blackout curtains smother the light. Most of the staff are gone, pulled into war work or military service. And in the basement, hidden in strong rooms, crates arrive from London. The National Gallery is moving its most valuable paintings out of the city. Rembrandts, Gainsboroughs, treasures that define British culture. They're stored at Waddesdon, entrusted to a house built by a Jewish family that England's aristocracy once treated as outsiders. The irony is almost unbearable. Ferrières' occupation was swift. German forces knew exactly where it was and what it contained. Officers arrived and declared the estate property of the Reich. Göring came in person. He walked through the galleries, pointing to paintings he wanted. His staff took notes. Crates were packed. Trucks rolled away with centuries of collected art. The châteaux became a headquarters for German command in the region. Soldiers drilled on the lawns. Equipment was stored in the stables. The great hall, designed to host emperors, became a military briefing room. At Waddesdon, the war arrived more quietly but with equal weight. James de Rothschild, who had inherited the estate, enlisted in the British Army despite being in his 40s. He served with distinction. While he was away, the house fell silent. Staff numbers dropped to a skeleton crew. Rooms were closed. Heat was cut to save fuel. The gardens, once immaculate, grew wild. Then came the request from the National Gallery. London was being bombed. The museum's collection needed protection. Waddesdon, isolated in the countryside with thick walls and secure basements, was ideal. Crates began arriving in 1940, each one carefully packed, each one labeled with inventory numbers. Inside were paintings that formed the backbone of British cultural heritage. Works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Gainsborough, Reynolds, and countless others, priceless, irreplaceable. The crates were stored in the basement strongrooms. Climate was monitored. Guards were posted. For the duration of the war, Waddesdon functioned as a vault. The house that Ferdinand built to prove he belonged in England was now protecting England's artistic soul. The same aristocracy that had mocked him as a Jewish upstart was trusting his house with their most precious possessions. When the war ended, the crates were retrieved. Every painting returned to London intact. Waddesdon had served, but the service came at a cost. The estate had been drained financially. James returned to find a house badly in need of repair and almost no resources to fund it. When the war ends in 1945, the Rothschild family begins the painful work of tallying losses. The Frankfurt house is destroyed. The Vienna estates are seized. Ferrières is returned but damaged and stripped of much of its art. Some pieces will never be recovered. Family members are dead. The banking network, which once spanned 5 capitals, is fractured. Only the London and Paris branches remain intact. Waddesdon survives structurally, but the world it was built for, the aristocratic, cosmopolitan Europe, where powerful families could operate above national borders, is gone. The question becomes, what do you do with a palace designed for a world that no longer exists? For estates like Waddesdon, the answer is reinvention. They can't function as private homes anymore. The costs are too high. Inheritance taxes are crushing landed estates across Europe. The only option is to open them to the public, to turn monuments of private wealth into museums, to let strangers walk through rooms that were built to exclude them. The inventory of losses was staggering. In Frankfurt, the ancestral house was rubble, bombed, looted, gone. In Vienna, the palaces were seized by the Nazis, then occupied by Soviet forces, then taken over by the Austrian state. Restitution claims dragged through courts for decades. Some properties were eventually returned, but in such poor condition that restoration was financially impossible. They were sold or donated. Ferrières came back but changed. The Germans had stripped it. Art was missing. Furniture was gone. The gardens were overgrown. The château had been used as a military headquarters, then left to decay. The family could have restored it, but the cost was prohibitive. France's post-war tax policies made maintaining large estates nearly impossible. Ferrières became a shell beautiful from a distance, but hollow. Waddesdon was intact, but broke. James had spent his own money keeping it alive during the war. Now he faced a choice: pour more money into a house that would never pay for itself, or find another solution. Across Britain, aristocratic families were facing the same dilemma. Inheritance taxes introduced after the war were designed to break up large estates. Death duties could claim up to 80% of an estate's value. Families were forced to sell land, art, and houses just to pay the tax bill. The Rothschilds had more resources than most, but even they couldn't ignore the arithmetic. The estates were liabilities. They consumed money. They generated nothing, and the social purpose they'd been built to serve, proving that the family belonged among Europe's elite, no longer mattered. The old aristocracy was collapsing. Titles didn't carry the weight they once had. The world was moving toward democracy, social mobility, and taxation of inherited wealth. The only path forward was to change what the estates were. They couldn't be private homes, but they could be museums, cultural institutions, educational sites. They could serve the public and, in doing so, justify their continued existence. It was a radical shift, but it was the only option that didn't end in demolition. James de Rothschild dies in 1957. His wife, Dorothy, inherits Waddesdon and faces an impossible choice. She can sell the estate, break up the collection, and let the house pass into unknown hands. Or she can collaborate with the National Trust, the British organization created to preserve historic properties, and shift Waddesdon from private palace to public heritage. It's a radical move. For Dorothy's generation, privacy was sacred. The idea of opening family rooms to ticket-buying crowds felt like surrender. But she's pragmatic. The estate is too expensive to maintain privately. Selling feels like erasing James's life work. The National Trust offers a middle path. The house will be preserved, the collection kept intact, and the public will finally have access. The deal is finalized in the late 1950s. Waddesdon becomes a museum. The transformation takes years. Rooms are rearranged for viewing, guides are trained, barriers protect furniture, but something fundamental changes. Waddesdon is no longer performing aristocratic belonging. It's evidence of ambition, beauty, and the fragility of wealth built on exclusion. Dorothy was in her 60s when James died. She had options. She was wealthy in her own right. She could have sold Waddesdon to developers and lived comfortably elsewhere. But she understood what the estate represented. It wasn't just a house. It was Ferdinand's life work. James had preserved it through war. Letting it be sold piecemeal felt like betrayal. The National Trust was a relatively new organization, founded in 1895 to preserve places of historic and natural beauty. By the 1950s, it had taken on dozens of estates that families could no longer afford to maintain. The model was simple. The family would transfer ownership to the trust. The trust would preserve the property and open it to the public. The family could retain some involvement, but control would shift to professional management. Dorothy negotiated carefully. She wanted guarantees. The house would be preserved to the highest standards. The art collection would remain intact. The family name would be honored. And the public would be educated about Waddesdon's history, not just the beauty, but the full story, including the labor that built it and the challenges the family faced. The agreement was finalized in the late 1950s, though the transition took years to complete. Rooms that had been private were opened. Furniture was rearranged for viewing and preservation. Ropes and barriers guided visitors and protected fragile surfaces. Staff were trained as guides. Marketing materials were produced. Waddesdon became a destination. The transformation was profound. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to prove he belonged, to force the aristocracy to accept him. Now, anyone who could afford a ticket could walk through his rooms. The exclusivity that had been central to the estate's purpose was gone. In its place was something more democratic: access. The house still dazzled. The gardens still impressed. But now they served a different function. Not private status, but public heritage. Dorothy lived to see Waddesdon thrive as a museum. Visitor numbers climbed. The estate became financially stable. The model worked. And in the process, Waddesdon became more honest. It stopped pretending to be something it wasn't and started teaching what it actually was, a monument to ambition, built by exploited labor, shaped by prejudice, and ultimately saved by surrender. Walk through Waddesdon today, and it gleams. The gardens are immaculate. The chandeliers still shine. Visitors come by the hundreds of thousands paying admission, taking photos, admiring the art. The house has been saved, but it's not the house Ferdinand built. That house was private, exclusive, designed to prove that a Rothschild could command the same respect as a duke. This house is public, accessible, and honest about its past in ways Ferdinand never was. The archives have been opened, servant records examined. The labor that built and maintained Waddesdon is finally part of the story. Ferrières has been partially restored and is used for conferences and events. Mentmore was sold and converted. The Vienna and Frankfurt estates are gone, some destroyed, some repurposed, none still in Rothschild hands. What remains is a question. What do these estates teach us? They teach that beauty has a cost, that permanence is fragile, that wealth can build walls but can't guarantee safety, that even the most powerful families are vulnerable to forces they can't control: war, prejudice, time. And they teach that survival sometimes means surrender, letting go of exclusivity, sharing what was built to be private, admitting that the dream, no matter how beautiful, was always too expensive to last. Today, Waddesdon is managed by the Rothschild Foundation, working closely with the National Trust. The estate welcomes over 400,000 visitors annually. The collections have been catalogued. Research has been conducted into every aspect of the house architecture, furnishings, gardens, and the lives of the people who worked there. Exhibits now include information about servants, their names, their roles, their wages. The invisible labor that made Waddesdon function is finally visible. Ferrières has had a different fate. After the war, it was too expensive to maintain as a private residence. The French Rothschilds eventually sold it. It's now used as a conference center and event space. The Grand Hall hosts corporate meetings. Weddings are held in the gardens. It's beautiful, functional, but no longer a home. The soul of the place, the sense that it was built for a specific purpose by a specific family, has faded. The Vienna and Frankfurt estates are simply gone. Some were destroyed in the war. Others were seized and repurposed. A few have been returned and converted into museums or government buildings, but none remain in Rothschild hands. The network that once spanned Europe has been reduced to 2 branches, London and Paris, and even those no longer control the estates that were meant to symbolize their permanence. What do the estates teach? First, that beauty is expensive, not just to build, but to maintain. The Rothschilds could afford the initial cost. What they couldn't sustain was the endless drain of upkeep, taxes, and repairs. Second, that permanence is an illusion. The estates were built to last forever. They lasted a few generations. Third, that wealth doesn't guarantee safety. The Rothschilds were richer than most European monarchs. It didn't protect them from war, prejudice, or political collapse. But the estates also teach something more hopeful. That adaptation is possible. Waddesdon survived because Dorothy was willing to change its purpose. It stopped being a private palace and became a public resource. In doing so, it found a new reason to exist. The dream Ferdinand had of building something permanent came true, just not in the way he imagined.